Well, welcome back. Monday, January 20th, 2020. I hope you all had a great weekend. By the way, ever notice the word inflation here? Nobody ever wishes anyone a good weekend. It has to be great. I wonder if that sets people up for disappointment. A little bit. I actually would like to come back to that because I think there's a truth there found from a little bit of humor, but a truth nonetheless about expectations in life. But in any event, welcome back. In political news, of course, you've read or heard that the New York Times has endorsed both Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. Absurd. They are so unbelievably transparent. Their point, just no man. Of course. But what absurdity, in any event, that those two are the ones they recommend. They are the least likely, perhaps excepting Tom Steyer, to receive the nomination from the Democrats. One is unknown, and the other, the more you know, the less you like and find true. This would help explain why Elizabeth Warren is in no poll in first or second place, and Klobuchar in no poll in first, second, or third place. Then, of course, in more political news, tomorrow the impeachment trial starts in the Senate. We'll get to all that, too, and Andy Biggs will be joining us later in the show. But first, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We spoke about this on Friday a little bit. Even knowing the faults and problems Martin Luther King, as they've come out over the years, am and remain a huge fan. I wish more did too. But I think perhaps his views are so out of step with the modern age, or at least what passes as the modern day of civil rights, that he's either not taught much or he's taught wrongly. First and foremost, how much have you seen him referred to as Dr. King? He was a doctor, a PhD, but he was also a reverend, and that's how he wanted to be known, addressed, and remembered. But then again, that would force our culture to grasp that he was a Christian minister. But that is what King said he wanted to be remembered for, if nothing else, as a man of God, a man who tried to serve God's will. Our culture doesn't like or reward that very much. Unless the man of God is Louis Farrakhan, people forget he too goes by minister. But for some reason, he's okay, and his message, usually speckled when not drenched in anti-gay sentiment or anti-Semitism, just gets a free pass. Why? Well, because he's about power and anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitic. So he figures well into the modern Islamist grievant culture narrative. It's a shame, but more, it's a sham. The legatee of the worst of Malcolm X is on more T-shirts and college campuses than the imagery of Martin Luther King Jr., I think in part because it's King's message that was one of colorblindness and love and certainly nonviolence. Oh, and yes, Christianity. Recall, King did not want any truck with Malcolm X, and there's only one or two pictures of the two of them together taken against King's wishes. One might say King was better at separating himself from Malcolm X than Bill Clinton was in separating himself from Louis Farrakhan, who he appeared on stage with and hugged less than 2 years ago. Anyway, if I might, back to King. No speech was given without a great many references to God, and no speech about America was given without praising our founding. Recall in his most famous speech, his I Have a Dream speech, he said, quote, "When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence," close quote, he said exactly that, magnificent, and the crowd shouted in approval. He spoke in the same speech of, quote, "the great vaults of opportunity of this nation," close quote. He knew this was a great country. It wasn't founded on slavery to him. Slavery was an aberration. It was founded on freedom. Somebody tell the New York Times and Al Sharpton and the entirety of the left and civil rights industry, please. King, in his dream speech, said, quote, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred," close quote. The audience shouted in agreement there, too. He spoke of his faith in this country and in God. More, he spoke of absolute right and wrong and good and evil. No postmodern philosophy or political philosophy or anthropology department in any college in America outside of perhaps Hillsdale and a few religious colleges would have any professor like that. You know, they're about moral relativism. But King, in a speech he would give over and over again, a sermon he called a knock at midnight, we played it on Friday, he would say things like this, quote, "It is also midnight within the moral order. At midnight, colors lose their distinctiveness and become a sullen shade of gray. Moral principles have lost their distinctiveness. For modern man, absolute right and wrong are a matter of what the majority is doing. Right and wrong are relatives to likes and dislikes and the customs of a particular community. We have unconsciously applied Einstein's theory of relativity, which properly described the physical universe, to the moral and ethical realm. Midnight is the hour when men desperately seek to obey the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not get caught. Close quote. He would cite Aquinas. He would cite the Bible. You know what else he would do? He loved Israel. Again and again, he spoke of his admiration for Israel and indeed would go so far as to say, quote, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism, close quote. Someone get that memo to Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. So as you can see, none of this is within the step of modern civil rights, and I didn't even begin to speak of his wish that we judge people by their character and not their color. No racial preference for him. He believed, as Thurgood Marshall wrote in his brief for the NAACP and Brown versus Board of Education, quote, distinctions of race are so evil, so arbitrary, so invidious that a state bound to defend the equal protections of the law must not invoke them in the public sphere, close quote. God, how I wished that were taught, that were the philosophy of the day today. It would go a long way, perhaps all the way, to getting beyond this race thing once and forever. But I fear there are people and institutions so invested in keeping the race thing alive that they want to keep it alive, to stoke it, to feed it, to grow it, not shrink it, not end it. Robert Woodson, a great civil leader who marched with King and who will join us on air in a bit, wrote this in the Wall Street Journal, quote, instead of celebrating blacks' achievements and the progress made toward delivering on America's promissory note, the left will transport yesterday's real injustices into today's false social justice narrative, ignoring the principles that were so crucial to Dr. King. History is full of inspiring examples of black people succeeding against the odds, including building their own schools, hotels, railroads, and banking systems when doors were closed to them. According to the economist Thomas Sowell, the poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% by 1960. These accomplishments were made possible by a set of values cherished among the blacks of the time: self-determination, resiliency, personal virtue, honesty, honor, and accountability. Dr. King understood that these values would be the bedrock for black success once true equality was won. As early as 1953, he warned that, quote, one of the most common tendencies of human nature is that of placing responsibility on some external agency for sins we have committed or mistakes we have made, close quote. Is that taught today? Nope. Quite the opposite. As Robert Woodson further put it, quote, Dr. King, who sought full participation in America, would never have indulged today's grievance-based identity politics, whose social justice warriors use race as a battering ram against the country. In fact, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King explicitly warned against the type of groupthink that characterizes identity politics. He said, quote, individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. Yesterday's values prepared blacks to walk through the doors of opportunity, open to them through civil rights. Family, faith, character, and moral behavior were all crucial to their victories. Today's social justice warriors trade on the currency of oppression, deriding the concept of personal responsibility, and always blaming external forces. I can think of no better way to instill hopelessness and fear in a young person than to tell him he is a victim, powerless to change his own circumstances. Quite right. If you wanted to continue to stoke racial animus in this country, you would ignore King and do exactly what too many in this culture are doing here today. My dream is that will stop. My dream is that Martin Luther King's dream will be enshrined to help ennoble and enrich us for the generations to come. It never really did, and with all the talking and all the fulminating and all the false teaching about what Dr. King, Reverend King, actually stood for, it's about time right now in 2020 to get it right. I'm Seth Leibsohn, 602-508-0960. We'll be right back. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my friends at Guns Etc. They are true American patriots. They strongly support our president, and they have over 10,200 square feet of firearms and firearm accessories. Please take my advice and stop by their store, which is a symbol of American freedom, or visit them at gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $350 million in firearms merchandise.